The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Prince William stood at the tall windows of his private study. His hands clasped behind his back, he watched the groundskeepers tend to the rose bushes that had personally selected years ago. The roses were blooming magnificently this spring, their deep red petals catching the early light like precious gems. But today, even their beauty couldn't ease the weight that had settled on his shoulders. 3 weeks had passed since the diagnosis. 3 weeks since their world had shifted on its axis, and everything they thought they knew about their future had been called into question. Illness had arrived like an uninvited guest, disrupting the carefully orchestrated rhythm of royal life. The medical team at the London clinic had been thorough, professional, and cautiously optimistic, but the word cancer still echoed in William's mind like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He turned away from the window and walked to his desk, where a stack of official documents awaited his attention. Among them was a letter bearing his father's seal, King Charles III. The envelope felt heavier than usual in his hands, though he knew that was impossible. Charles had requested a private meeting that morning, something about important changes that needed to be discussed. William suspected it had something to do with his condition and the adjustments they would need to make to their public duties. The sound of soft footsteps in the corridor made him look up. Appeared in the doorway, still in her dressing gown, her hair loosely braided over one shoulder. Despite everything, she remained breathtakingly beautiful to him. The treatments hadn't begun yet, but the knowledge of what lay ahead had already changed something in her eyes, a new depth, a quiet determination that both inspired and worried him. "You're up early," she said, settling into the comfortable armchair near his desk. "Couldn't sleep again." William set down the unopened letter and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. They were warm and soft, exactly as they had been on their wedding day 14 years ago. "I was thinking about the children," he admitted, "about how we're going to explain all of this to them." George, at 10 years old, was beginning to understand the weight of his future responsibilities. Charlotte, 8, possessed an intuitive wisdom that sometimes startled the adults around her. And Louis, just 6, still believed his parents were invincible. How do you tell children that one of their heroes is fighting an invisible battle? Squeezed his hands gently. "We tell them the truth, but in a way they can understand. Children are more resilient than we think, William. They need to know what's happening, but they also need to feel secure. That's our job, to be their anchor while we navigate this storm." The wisdom in her words reminded him why he had fallen in love with her all those years ago at university. Even facing her own uncertainty, she was thinking about others, about how to protect and nurture those she loved. It was this quality that had made her such a beloved member of the royal family and such a devoted mother. A gentle knock interrupted their moment. William's private secretary, James, appeared at the door with his usual diplomatic smile. "Your Royal Highness, His Majesty has arrived and is waiting in the blue drawing room." William nodded and stood, helping to her feet. "Would you like me to come with you?" she asked, though they both knew she needed to rest. "This is something I need to handle alone," William replied, kissing her forehead softly. "But we'll talk about everything afterward, no secrets between us." As he made his way through the familiar corridors of Windsor Castle, William's mind wandered to the countless conversations he'd had with his father over the years. Some had been formal, about duty and protocol. Others had been deeply personal, about love, loss, and the burden of being born into a life of service. Today felt different, though. There was an urgency in Charles's request that suggested momentous changes were coming. The blue drawing room was bathed in soft morning light when William entered. King Charles stood near the fireplace, no longer the uncertain figure who had assumed the throne after Elizabeth's passing. 18 months of kingship had given him a confidence and gravitas that suited him well. But today, there was something else in his demeanor, a father's concern mixing with a monarch's responsibility. "William," Charles said, embracing his eldest son warmly, "thank you for coming so early. I know these have been difficult weeks for your family." They settled into adjacent chairs, the formal protocols of court temporarily set aside for a conversation between father and son. Charles's blue eyes, so similar to William's own, held a mixture of sympathy and determination. "How is managing?" Charles asked first, because despite being a king, he was also a grandfather who cared deeply about his families. "She's remarkable as always," William replied. "Stronger than she knows, though I wish she didn't have to prove it this way. The children are asking questions, but we're trying to maintain as much normalcy as possible." Charles nodded thoughtfully. That's wise. Children need stability, especially during uncertain times, which brings me to why I asked you here this morning. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've been in discussions with the Privy Council and the Archbishop of Canterbury about implementing some changes to royal protocols. William felt his pulse quicken. In the month since his father's coronation, there had been whispers about modernizing certain aspects of the monarchy, but most had assumed these would be gradual changes implemented over years, not months. What kind of changes? William asked, though part of him already suspected the answer. Charles leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. I'm planning to formally alter the rules regarding succession and the distribution of royal duties during times of personal crisis. Specifically, I want to create provisions that will allow the direct heir to step into expanded roles immediately when circumstances require it, without waiting for my abdication or incapacitation. The implications of his father's words began to sink in. This wasn't just about adjusting schedules or redistributing ceremonial duties. Charles was talking about fundamentally changing how the monarchy operated, creating flexibility that had never existed before in their thousand-year history. You're talking about giving me greater authority while you're still king, William said slowly. I'm talking about preparing our family and our institution for the realities of the 21st century, Charles replied firmly. Your wife is facing a health crisis that will require months of treatment and recovery. You need to be with her to support her and your children. But you also have responsibilities to the crown and to the people. The old way of doing things, the rigid adherence to protocol regardless of personal circumstances, that doesn't serve anyone well. William sat back in his chair, processing the magnitude of what his father was proposing. For centuries, the monarchy had operated on the principle that duty came before all else, that personal needs must be subordinated to the demands of the crown. It was a principle that had sustained them through wars, scandals, and social upheaval, but it had also exacted a terrible personal cost from many members of the royal family. The Archbishop has assured me that there are precedents for this kind of arrangement, Charles continued. Not in recent memory, certainly, but during times of war and national crisis, the Crown has shown flexibility. I believe illness and your family's needs constitute exactly such a circumstance. As William listened to his father outline the proposed changes, he felt a complex mixture of gratitude, apprehension, and hope. Gratitude that his father understood the impossible position he was in. Apprehension about taking on expanded responsibilities during an already difficult time. And hope that perhaps, finally, they could find a way to honor both duty and family, service and love. The morning sun had climbed higher now, filling the blue drawing room with golden light. Outside, the world continued its ordinary rhythm, unaware that within these historic walls, the future of the British monarchy was being quietly, carefully reshaped by a father's love for his son and a grandfather's concern for his. Charles reached across the space between their chairs and placed his hand on William's shoulder. I know this is a lot to consider, especially now, but I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my complete support. The Crown will adapt to serve our family's needs, not the other way around. For William, who had spent his entire life being told that the Crown came first, always and without exception, his father's words felt like a gift beyond measure. Perhaps it was possible to be both a devoted husband and father and a faithful servant of the realm. Perhaps the choice he had always feared he might have to make, between family and duty, wasn't a choice he would have to make after all. 3 days later, William found himself in the private chapel at Kensington Palace, a place where he had often sought solace during difficult times. The late afternoon light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the simple wooden pews. He wasn't particularly religious in a conventional sense, but there was something about the quiet sanctity of this space that helped him think clearly. The conversation with his father continued to replay in his mind. Charles had given him 48 hours to consider the proposal, understanding that such a momentous decision couldn't be rushed. The changes would need to be announced publicly, which meant scrutiny from the media, debate in Parliament, and inevitable criticism from traditionalists who believed the monarchy should remain unchanged. But it wasn't the public reaction that concerned William most. It was response. He hadn't told her about their conversation yet, partly because he wanted to fully understand the implications himself before bringing her into the discussion. Was already carrying so much, the weight of her diagnosis, concerns about the children, anxiety about letting down the charities and causes she championed. He didn't want to add the pressure of this decision to her burdens. The chapel door opened quietly, and William looked up to see his grandmother-in-law approaching. Had become an invaluable source of support since diagnosis, helping with the children and providing the kind of practical, no-nonsense assistance that only a mother could offer. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," said softly, settling into the pew beside him. "Mentioned you might be here." William shook his head. "I'm grateful for the company, actually. How is she doing today?" "Better than yesterday," replied honestly. "She's napping now, which is good. The fatigue has been hitting her harder than she expected." She studied William's face with the perceptive eye of someone who had raised 3 children and understood the weight of unspoken worries. "But something else is troubling you, something beyond health." William had always appreciated its directness. Unlike many people in his orbit, she didn't treat him differently because of his title. To her, he was simply the man who loved her daughter, and that gave her a unique perspective that he valued deeply. "My father wants to change how the succession works," William said finally. "Not the order, that stays the same, but he wants to give me expanded authority now while is going through treatment. It would be unprecedented." Considered this for a long moment, "And you're worried about how we'll react?" "Among other things, yes. She's always been so conscious of doing everything properly, of not being seen as seeking special treatment or exceptions. This would definitely be an exception." "William," said gently, "may I tell you something about my daughter that you might not fully appreciate, even after all these years?" He nodded, curious about what insight she might offer. "Has never wanted special treatment for herself, that's true. But she would move heaven and earth to protect her family. If your father is offering this change because he believes it will help you be there for her and the children while still fulfilling your royal duties, she'll support it. Not because she wants an easier path, but because she wants what's best for all of you." The wisdom in its words resonated deeply with William. He had been so focused on protecting from additional stress that he hadn't considered how his worry and indecision might actually be causing her more anxiety than the decision itself. "There's something else," continued. "Has been concerned about you. She knows you're struggling with feeling torn between wanting to be with her constantly and knowing you have responsibilities you can't simply abandon. She's been losing sleep worrying that you're sacrificing too much for her." This revelation hit William like a physical blow. While he had been trying to shield from difficult decisions, she had been torturing herself with the belief that she was the source of his distress. The irony was both painful and illuminating. "I should have talked to her immediately," William realized aloud. "Yes, you should have," agreed with a gentle smile. "But it's not too late. In fact, I think she would appreciate being included in this decision. Has always been at her best when she feels useful, when she feels like she's contributing to solutions rather than being protected from problems." As if summoned by their conversation, the chapel door opened again and appeared. She looked better than she had in days, more color in her cheeks, more life in her eyes. She was wearing a simple blue dress that William had always loved on her, and her hair was pulled back in the casual style she preferred when they were at home. "I wondered where you disappeared to," she said, joining them in the pew. "Hello, Mum. Have you been having a proper heart-to-heart without me?" William and exchanged a meaningful look and stood gracefully. "I think that's my cue to go check on the children. They were plotting something involving finger paints when I last saw them." After left, moved closer to William, taking his hand in hers. "You've been carrying something heavy for days. I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, the way you get that little crease between your eyebrows when you think I'm not looking." William found himself smiling despite his serious mood. After 14 years of marriage, could read him like a favorite book, knowing exactly which pages contain the important plot points. "My father has proposed some changes to royal protocol," William began, and then told her everything. The conversation with Charles, the proposed alterations to succession responsibilities, the potential for William to take on expanded duties while remaining heir rather than king. He explained his concerns about public reaction, his worries about setting precedents, and his fear that she would feel pressured to support something she wasn't comfortable with. Listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes, considering everything he had told her. "Your father is a wise man," she said finally, "and a loving one. This isn't about changing succession for political reasons or personal ambition. This is about recognizing that the monarchy exists to serve the people, and sometimes that means adapting to meet the needs of the moment. But the precedent it sets, William began. The precedent it sets, interrupted gently, is that the crown can be both strong and flexible. That duty and compassion aren't mutually exclusive. That being royal doesn't mean being inhuman. She turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with conviction. William, do you know what has worried me most since my diagnosis? It hasn't been the treatment or the uncertainty about my prognosis. It's been watching you tear yourself apart trying to be everywhere at once, trying to be perfect in every role while your heart is breaking with worry. Her words brought tears to William's eyes. I just want to take care of you, all of you, the children, the crown, the country, everyone who depends on us. And that's exactly why your father's proposal makes sense, said firmly. It creates a structure that allows you to do exactly that. You can be present for our family during this difficult time while still serving the crown effectively. You won't have to choose between being a good husband and father and being a good prince. The relief that washed over William was almost overwhelming. The fear that had been gnawing at him, that he would be forced to choose between his love for his family and his duty to his country, was dissolving in the face of unwavering support. There will be criticism, he warned her. People who say we're changing fundamental traditions for personal convenience. Smile held a touch of steel. Let them criticize. We know the truth, and the people who matter will understand. Besides, the monarchy has survived much worse than a few grumpy headlines. As they sat together in the peaceful chapel, William felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in weeks. The path forward was still uncertain, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but at least they would face them together, with the support of a king who understood that true leadership sometimes meant breaking with tradition. So we tell my father yes, William asked, though he already knew the answer. We tell him yes, confirmed. And then we focus on what really matters, getting me healthy, keeping our family strong, and showing the world that the monarchy can evolve without losing its heart. The golden afternoon light continued to stream through the stained glass windows, but now it felt less like a farewell to something ending and more like a dawn breaking on something new. Outside, the world waited for the announcement that would change the British monarchy forever, though they didn't know it yet. Inside the chapel, a prince and his wife held hands and planned a future that honored both tradition and love, duty and family, the crown and the human heart that beat beneath it. The state dining room at Palace had never felt quite so intimate, despite its grand proportions and gilded splendor. King Charles had specifically chosen this room for the family dinner he had requested, understanding that sometimes the most important conversations happened over shared meals rather than in formal meeting rooms. The evening light streaming through the tall windows caught the crystal and silver, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the pristine white tablecloth. William and sat side by side, their hands occasionally finding each other beneath the table. Across from them, the Queen Consort offered gentle smiles of encouragement, while Charles carved the roast with the practiced ease of a man who had learned early that kings, too, must sometimes perform the most ordinary of tasks. The children had already eaten in the nursery, sparing the adults the need to monitor table manners while navigating such weighty topics. George had asked why they couldn't join the grown-ups for dinner, displaying the natural curiosity of a boy who was beginning to understand that he lived in a world where ordinary family meals often carried extraordinary significance. I've spoken with the Prime Minister, Charles began as they settled into the main course. She's supportive of the changes we discussed. In fact, she believes they demonstrate exactly the kind of modernization the monarchy needs to remain relevant in the 21st century. Set down her fork, her appetite still fragile despite her determination to maintain normalcy. What about Parliament? Will they need to vote on the changes? Not in the traditional sense, Charles replied. The adjustments I'm proposing fall within the Crown's prerogative to organize its own internal structure. However, the Prime Minister will make a statement in the Commons explaining the changes and their rationale. William felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had grown up in the public eye, but the prospect of having his family's most private struggles dissected in parliamentary debate and newspaper editorials still made him uncomfortable. How much detail will be made public about its condition? Only what you're both comfortable sharing, interjected softly. The palace statement will be carefully crafted to explain the need for flexibility in royal duties without compromising your privacy or dignity. This consideration for their boundaries meant more to William than his stepmother might have realized. Throughout diagnosis and treatment planning, they had been acutely aware of the balance between public accountability and private pain. The royal family belonged to the British people in many ways, but some moments, the quiet fears whispered in the darkness, the tears shed over morning coffee, the fierce determination to shield their children from adult worries, those moments belonged to them alone. "There's something else we need to discuss," Charles said, his tone becoming more serious. "The Archbishop of Canterbury has requested a private ceremony to formally recognize the expanded role. Nothing elaborate, but something with appropriate solemnity. He believes it will help establish the legitimacy of the arrangement in the eyes of those who might question its authority." Nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. If we're asking people to accept a significant change to constitutional practice, we need to treat it with the gravity it deserves." The conversation continued through the evening, covering practical details that would have seemed mundane to outsiders, but carried enormous weight for a family whose every decision rippled outward through centuries of tradition. Which charities would continue to patron during her treatment? How would William's new authority be exercised in practice? What provisions would be made for the possibility that treatment might take longer than expected? As they discussed these matters, William found himself observing his wife with renewed admiration. Despite facing her own health crisis, approached each question with the same thoughtful consideration she brought to all her royal duties. She asked about the impact on other family members, worried about the additional burden on Charles, and insisted that any changes should enhance rather than diminish the monarchy's service to the people. "I keep thinking about the letters," said during a brief lull in the conversation. "The ones we receive from families dealing with illness, from children whose parents are sick. If our situation can help demonstrate that it's possible to maintain hope and purpose while facing health challenges, then perhaps some good can come from all of this." Her words reminded William why he had fallen in love with her. Even in her darkest moments, his instinct was to consider how their experiences might help others. She had transformed from a shy university student into a woman who understood that every aspect of her life could be a source of comfort or inspiration for people facing their own struggles. "The ceremony will take place next week," Charles announced as they moved to the drawing room for coffee. "Small and private, just immediate family and a few necessary officials. The public announcement will come afterward." William felt a sudden surge of nervousness. Until this moment, the changes had felt theoretical, a possibility they were considering rather than a reality they were implementing. The mention of a specific date made everything concrete, irreversible. Must have sensed his anxiety because she moved closer on the sofa, her presence offering the quiet reassurance that had sustained him through countless public appearances and private challenges. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked softly. "Not about the decision," William replied honestly, "but about everything that comes after. This changes us, doesn't it? Not just our roles, but who we are as a family, as members of the institution." "Everything worthwhile involves change," observed from her chair near the window. "When your father and I married, people said it would change the monarchy forever. They were right, but not in the ways they expected. It made it more honest, more human. These changes will do the same thing." Charles joined the conversation from his position near the fireplace, where he had been standing in the same contemplative pose William remembered from childhood. "The monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years not because it never changed, but because it changed when change was necessary. What we're doing isn't revolutionary, it's evolutionary." As the evening wound down, the four adults found themselves in a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the week ahead. The decision had been made, the arrangements were in motion, and soon the world would learn that the British crown was adapting once again to meet the needs of the moment. "I want to say something to you both," said suddenly, addressing Charles, "and William and I are grateful beyond words for your support. Many families facing a health crisis feel isolated, abandoned by institutions that can't bend to accommodate human frailty. You've shown us that the crown can be both strong and compassionate." Charles's eyes grew misty, and he reached for his hand. "My dear, you and William have brought such joy to this family. If the crown cannot protect and support its own members during times of need, what kind of institution would it be?" The drive back to Kensington Palace was quiet, both William and lost in their own reflections. London streamed past their windows in its usual river of lights and movement, a city full of people living their own dramas, facing their own challenges. Soon, their private struggle would become public knowledge, their family's adaptation to crisis a matter of national and international interest. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" William asked as their car turned into the palace gates. Considered the question seriously before answering. "I think we're doing the human thing, and sometimes that's the most royal thing of all." Back in their private apartments, they looked in on the children, who were sleeping peacefully in their beds. George had fallen asleep with a book about aircraft still open beside him. Charlotte clutched a stuffed horse that had been a gift from the late Queen Elizabeth. Louis lay sprawled across his bed in the unself-conscious way of very young children, one arm thrown over his eyes as if blocking out the world's complications. Standing in the doorway watching their children sleep, William felt the full weight of what the coming week would bring. The ceremony that would formally alter his role, the public announcement that would change how the world saw their family, the beginning of a new chapter in their lives that would be written while fought the most important battle of her life. But looking at those three sleeping faces, George, who would one day be king, Charlotte, who would spend her life in service to the crown, and Louis, who would find his own way to contribute to their family's legacy, William felt not fear but determination. They were not just changing royal protocol. They were demonstrating that duty and love could coexist, that the monarchy could adapt without losing its essential character. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time since diagnosis, William felt confident that they would face it together, supported by a crown that had learned to bend without breaking. The morning of the ceremony dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight filtering through the ancient windows of George's chapel at Windsor Castle. William stood before the altar where he and had celebrated their wedding 14 years earlier, where Prince Harry had married, where generations of royals had marked the most significant moments of their lives. Today, history would record another first, the formal recognition of a prince regent serving alongside a reigning monarch, a modernization born not of political ambition, but of love and necessity. Sat in the front pew, radiant despite the challenges she faced. She had chosen a navy blue dress coat with subtle pearl buttons, a nod to both tradition and her own emerging strength. Her hair was styled in the elegant chignon she favored for formal occasions, and the sapphire earrings that had belonged to Princess Diana caught the light as she turned to smile at their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis sat beside her, their behavior impeccable despite their young ages. They had been carefully prepared for what they would witness, understanding that this was an important day for their family without fully grasping its historical significance. George wore his first proper suit, looking startlingly mature for 10 years old. Charlotte sat perfectly straight in her blue dress, occasionally whispering quiet observations to her younger brother. Louis, now 6 and infinitely more composed than he had been at his grandfather's coronation, swung his legs gently from the pew, his eyes wide with interest at the ceremonial proceedings. The Archbishop of Canterbury stood before the altar, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel as he spoke words that had been carefully crafted for this unprecedented occasion. "We gather today to witness the formal recognition of new arrangements within our constitutional monarchy, arrangements born of wisdom, compassion, and the understanding that duty and family are not opposing forces but complementary strengths." King Charles sat in the front row opposite his family, resplendent in his formal uniform, but somehow more at ease than William had ever seen him at such ceremonies. Beside him, Queen Consort watched with tears in her eyes, understanding perhaps better than anyone what this moment meant for the family she had joined and come to love deeply. As the Archbishop continued, William's mind wandered to the conversation he and had shared the night before. They had sat in their private sitting room after putting the children to bed, talking quietly about the magnitude of what was happening. Had expressed concern about whether she was strong enough to fulfill her role as Princess Regent's consort, whether her treatment would interfere with the duties this new arrangement would require. "You don't have to be strong enough for everything," William had told her. "You just have to be strong enough for today, and then tomorrow, and then the day after that. We'll take it one day at a time." Now, as the Archbishop called him forward to the altar, William felt the truth of those words resonating through his chest. This wasn't about guaranteeing a perfect future or eliminating all uncertainty. It was about creating a framework that would allow them to serve with honor while protecting what mattered most: their family, their love for each other, and their commitment to both duty and humanity. Prince William Arthur Philip Louis, the Archbishop intoned. Do you solemnly promise and swear to exercise the expanded authorities granted to you by His Majesty the King with wisdom, compassion, and unwavering dedication to the welfare of the British people and the Commonwealth realms? I solemnly promise so to do, William replied, his voice steady and clear. The words felt both monumental and natural, like stepping into shoes that had been made specifically for him. The ceremony was brief by royal standards, but each element carried deep significance. When Charles stepped forward to present William with a special seal of office, created specifically for this role, the symbolism was unmistakable. This was not an abdication or a transition of power, but a partnership between father and son, king and heir, tradition and innovation. Following the formal proceedings, the family gathered in the smaller private chapel for a moment of reflection. Here, away from the cameras and official observers, they could simply be themselves, a family navigating an uncertain future with love as their compass. I'm proud of you both, Charles said, embracing William and together. What you're doing requires tremendous courage. You're showing the world that the monarchy can evolve to meet human needs without losing its essential dignity. Hugged her father-in-law tightly. Thank you for making this possible, for understanding that sometimes the most traditional thing you can do is break with tradition. The children, who had been remarkably patient throughout the ceremony, finally allowed their natural exuberance to emerge. George peppered his father with questions about what his new role would mean in practical terms. Charlotte wanted to know if this meant they would move to a different palace. Louis was primarily interested in whether there would be a special lunch to celebrate, displaying his characteristic focus on the immediate and tangible. Everything important stays the same, William assured them. We're still a family first. We still live at Kensington Palace. I still help you with your homework and read you bedtime stories. The only difference is that I'll have some additional responsibilities to help Grandpapa with his work as king. Later, as they prepared to return to London, pulled William aside for a private moment in the garden where they had posed for their engagement photos. The roses were past their summer bloom, but the garden remained beautiful in its autumn dress of gold and russet leaves. I need you to know something, she said, taking his hands in hers. These past weeks, watching you struggle with impossible choices, seeing you tear yourself apart trying to be everything to everyone, it's made me realize how strong our love really is. Not because it's been tested, but because it's remained constant through the testing. William felt tears threaten at her words. I was so afraid of losing you, or of failing you, or of being forced to choose between being your husband and being the heir to the throne. You'll never have to make that choice, replied firmly. Because those roles aren't separate from each other, they're part of the same person. You are the man I fell in love with precisely because you care so deeply about service, about duty, about making a difference in the world. I wouldn't want you to change that for me or for anyone. As they stood together in the garden, surrounded by the gentle sounds of autumn and the distant laughter of their children, William felt a peace he hadn't experienced since before diagnosis. The future remained uncertain. Her treatment would be long and difficult. His expanded role would bring new pressures and responsibilities, and the public scrutiny would be intense. But they would face all of it together, supported by a crown that had proven it could bend without breaking. The announcement was released to the media that afternoon, carefully crafted to explain the constitutional innovation while respecting the family's privacy. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Editorial writers praised the monarchy's adaptability. Constitutional scholars debated the historical precedents. And most importantly, ordinary families facing their own health crises expressed gratitude that even the royal family acknowledged the difficulty of balancing duty and care. That evening, back in their private apartments at Kensington Palace, William sat with their children in the familiar comfort of their sitting room. The formal ceremonies and public announcements were over. Now came the real work of living up to the promises they had made. Are you scared, Papa? Charlotte asked with the directness that never failed to startle the adults around her. William considered the question seriously. Yes, sometimes, but being scared doesn't mean we can't be brave. It just means we understand that what we're doing is important. Mama's brave, Louis declared with 6-year-old certainty. She's fighting the bad cells in her body like a superhero. Laughed, the first genuinely carefree sound William had heard from her in weeks. I don't feel much like a superhero most days, but I feel very lucky to have such wonderful helpers in my fight. As bedtime approached and the children reluctantly headed to their rooms, William and remained curled together on their sofa, watching the last light fade from the London sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and the beginning of treatment. But tonight, they were simply a husband and wife who had found a way to honor both love and duty, who had proven that the oldest institutions could learn new ways of serving the human heart. "Whatever happens next," William said softly, "we'll face it together. As partners, as parents, as people who understand that the greatest privilege of our position is the opportunity to serve others while protecting what we love most." Nestled closer, her head finding its familiar place against his shoulder. "Together," she agreed, "always together." Outside, London settled into its evening rhythm, unaware that in the quiet rooms of Kensington Palace, a prince and princess were writing a new chapter in the ancient story of the crown, a chapter that would be remembered not for its drama or constitutional significance, but for its simple insistence that love and duty could coexist, that tradition could embrace change, and that even kingdoms could learn to put family first.